So thank you all for being here. This panel is, do we have the title of the panel? Let's just remind myself. Building Pathways to Urban Equality, Reflections on Knowledge Translation, Learning and Impact. The objective of the panel, when we were discussing how we're going to structure, is to really think about the research, how research builds pathways to urban equality. We propose to focus on the ways in which impact is built throughout the life of the research project, not just as an outcome in the end. So what you're going to be hearing, presentations about different research initiatives that have been trying to think about how impact is built throughout the life of a project. Using the idea of pathways, we seek to understand how research activities build impacts and learning that influence institutions, capabilities, practices, and urban trajectories. So I think we're going to have a very rich discussion. And we're going to start with a paper that Camila Cocina and Stephanie Cocina and
It's been how many years?
How many years?
Who knows?
Thank you very much. Okay. And Stephanie Butcher are going to be presenting. It's and I think it's my engagement with Italians too long, you know. And it's a paper that is going to be reflecting on some of the reflections of one of the work package of No. And then we move on to the next presentation. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. The presentation that we are going to be sharing with you today, it's specifically focused on the notions of knowledge and on the concept that we have been working with, that is the idea of knowledge translation, and basically understanding how knowledge travels and how knowledge actually can create impact through the life of a research project. The most important assumption behind this is that to address urban equality, to really challenge the way opportunities are distributed, we need to transform also the way in which knowledge is produced, knowledge is recognized, knowledge is valued. That is at the core of how we challenge opportunities in society. So that's very much what is behind this presentation. So, what is it? Which one is the... Perfect. So the work that we will be presenting is an ongoing work in progress in our relationship within the No project with two partners in Freetown, Sierra Leone, and in Havana, Cuba. You have heard from both of them in the last few days, so you know the kind of work that they are doing. But the interesting thing for us is that we are trying, on the one hand, to document, reveal how knowledge travels, how knowledge actually is produced and shared. But on the other hand, also to use that documenting as a way for supporting the research project and to understand what kind of strategies can be taken in order to strengthen the impact of the project. To do so, we, just as a way of framing, we have been using this idea of knowledge translation, very much to challenge the idea that knowledge always travels from research to practice. And we have drawn on a series of discussions, mainly from Southern and feminist theories, that very much have challenged the way in which knowledge is understood, always coming from certain spaces, from certain geographies, and from certain kinds of institutions. So we understand knowledge translation basically as a non-linear process, a process that happens in spaces that we have called interfaces, those moments, experiences in which knowledge travels in different directions. And those spaces we understand are very much dominated by power relationships, by different geographies, and also are populated by a series of elements, no? Like there are actors that are mobilizing knowledge, but there are also different instruments that are used to mobilize knowledge. Knowledge is mobilized through documents, through events like these ones, to policy papers, to etc., a series of things. And there are tactics that different actors use to do that. They come and meet people, they generate spaces, and we're trying to unpack what these different elements are in order to really understand how knowledge has been used in the past and how it can be used in the future to actually strengthen the impact. So now we're going to explore a little bit of those two, and I will give you, I will pass you Steph to explain a little bit about the methodology that we're using.
Thanks very much. So the methodology that we'd like to present to you today is a process of what we're calling a historical mapping. And that's a way of trying to trace and make visible the way in which these interfaces are being formed through the different instruments, tactics, actors, typologies, and how that's mobilizing knowledge over time in these two very different contexts. The material that we're using in order to produce this map is the product of site visits in Havana and in Freetown, interviews with key stakeholders, focus groups with different urban communities that our partners SLURC and Kuhai are working with, as well as an analysis of policy documents, reports, and briefs. I will say as a caveat that, of course, what we'll present to you today is not a comprehensive review of all of the events or all of the historical processes that have happened over time in these places, of course, but rather a reflection of some of the key events and key moments in which we can see this sort of translation and mobilization of knowledge. So for today, we will be presenting not so much the content of these timelines, but really thinking about this as a methodology and some reflections on what this allows us to see, particularly thinking about how we can build research around this idea of impact and the impact strategies of our partners. So with that, we'll move first to Freetown. And in Freetown, when we talk about progressing an urban equality agenda, the way in which that's being understood by our partner, as you've already heard, is around shaping an inclusive informal settlement upgrading agenda. So what we're really looking at is the knowledge translation processes over time that have progressed this upgrading agenda, right? From a move from eviction towards a slightly more progressive view of informal settlements. So I present to you our first historical map, a bit of a beast, but what you can see here is at the top, what we've started with is mapping the sort of contextual features and key events which have been communicated to us through this range of interviews and experiences. I will note that this is a series of events following the end of the Civil War, so post-2001 in the context of Freetown. So, of course, this is representative of knowledge translation happening in a very particular moment in time, and there's a whole range of things we could say before that as well, but that's really what the focus of this is today. So when we started putting this together, we started mapping these different events that have occurred at different scales. And underneath that, we started thinking through what were the different instruments that were emerging around these events and what were the different tactics used to mobilize or even contest some of these instruments. So you can see mapped some of in red, you can see some of the instruments, reports, briefs, workshops, and then in green linked with that the tactics, so the sort of practices that emerged to use these instruments. And as we started to go through this process, we started seeing some clusters. And in blue is what we're calling the interfaces, where you can see this kind of dynamic interaction between different instruments and tactics that are somehow clustered around particular things. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those things are. Ooh, no. Yes. So the first thing, now I just want to talk a little bit about what this kind of methodology shows us. So the first thing that I want to highlight is we started to find that as we clustered these interfaces, they were starting to show us different moments in which knowledge was being translated. So we have the first moment, which is really what we've called the emergence of new knowledges and consciousness. And actually, this is really linked with a kind of emerging knowledge around the consolidation of spatial data in informal settlements. And that is in very different ways. So from mapping and profiling through the emergence of the Federation of the Urban Poor, but also through GIS and spatial data, so very different forms of talking to the same thing. Our second moment is around the raising recognition of knowledges. And this is where, as Juan mentioned, you start to see much more of an interface between different forms and kinds and typologies of knowledge. And this is really where consortiums and networks start to come to the fore. And third, the consolidation of what we're calling epistemic communities of practice, which is really in reference to the fact that you're starting to see a form of institutionalization at different scales, which we will talk about. The second thing I'll highlight is that, of course, as we know, there are very different forms of knowledge initiated by different actors and for different purposes, which we're starting to map out. But what I really want to focus on now is the kind of synergies and tensions that we've started to see and what this means for knowledge translation processes. So something that emerged very clearly is that, of course, there's a very, very strong sense of synergy between different forms of knowledge intersecting and being translated for impact. So, for example, something that came very clearly was the narrative that, of course, the Federation themselves had been doing a series of mapping activities. They had plenty of information about their settlement and had been doing this for many years. But it was through the emergence of our partner SLURC as a research institution and the translation of this information into very officialized reports and briefs that suddenly created a different form of traction, right? So suddenly it's through this referencing that local authorities started realizing that if SLURC can talk about these guys, then they're very good players in this game. And we heard yesterday from Brima and Joseph that actually it's this Federation-produced data that's now being referenced even in the midterm national development plan. So actually moving very effectively through different policy scales. And of course, there's a whole range of other synergies all throughout this history, but of course, not much time to talk about it. So really then, my second point is around the tensions, and that's to say that while we've got this kind of very incredible set of synergies, in fact, sometimes you see conflicts or frictions where different understandings of what knowledge is or who is responsible for producing knowledge start to meet each other in perhaps not quite smooth ways. And this is something that emerged very clearly around an event in 2015, where there was a major flooding and series of eviction events in Freetown. And it was in this moment, this kind of crisis moment, when there was a real recognition from the national level, from the Office of National Security, that actually maybe there's a role for community-based disaster risk management. Maybe we need to be talking to communities on the ground. But the way in which this is articulated is as if it's a blank slate, as if there's no capacity that has ever existed before. So of course, we need to first identify those that are trainable. We need to set up some forms of structures in those communities, and only after that can we dialogue. And this is a narrative that was contested very strongly by the chairman of the Federation in saying that, in fact, we've had community disaster management committees for a very long time. And in fact, now the ONS, the National Security Office, has come in and they're actually trying to take over this process and not allow us to direct it. So what you see is a real recognition from the national level of this kind of knowledge, but a total misrecognition of the capacity that already existed in that space. And finally, thinking about these opportunities and challenges in the context of this moment of institutionalization, what we've seen is a whole series of opportunities. So particularly thinking about at the city scale, the way in which SLURC has managed to dialogue in working groups with the city council is influencing policy at all scales, and this has created a whole range of really incredible impacts. But at the same time, this creates risks. And we heard yesterday that as the Freetown City Council has become more interested in this work and validated this work, they're also starting to take a bit of ownership and perhaps skew the agenda. And what happens in this context of very unequal power relations in knowledge production, when you have perhaps some actors which are interested in issues such as efficient management of the city and allocation of resources, and actors that are interested in urban equality, and who is able to dictate which agenda is driving the research and the knowledge co-production that's being done. And that's not only at the city scale, but also at the scale of communities. So, for example, what you're seeing is a real consolidation of these systems of representation through the Federation, and that's allowing the Federation to move through even international processes and dialogue with donors such as the World Bank to really start to get on the agenda. But that's being distributed in very different ways across different settlements. So from one informal settlement, Coco Bay, which has not really seen any of the distributional gains of some of these processes, there's a real sense that, yes, we know we have knowledge, and we know other people acknowledge we have knowledge, but we still don't have the power. And so there's a real unevenness in how this is being experienced across different settlements in the city.
Thank you. So moving quickly to the case of Havana, that is a case that we have been working for a bit of a shorter time. But in the case of Havana, the idea of the urban equality agenda, our partners have defined it as, the main agenda that they have defined is the idea of positioning the university as a key national urban actor and trying to find how the university can be a broker in advancing the urban equality agenda. So it's quite different than the case of Freetown with a more specific kind of slum upgrading agenda. In this case, it's more about the institution of the university as an actor. And in doing this map, we actually realized that the kind of exercise that we had to do was quite different. different because, and I'm going to go in a bit of detail, but basically the understanding of the university as an actor needs to be seen in this kind of wider historical process that in the case of Cuba is impossible to detach from the more national wider processes. And at the national level, the university has a mandate and has had a mandate for the last, from the last 70 years as a social actor. But that mandate has changed over time. Like if in the first years of the revolution, the university was seen as a very important and key actor and many of the efforts were about building this institutional strength to, in Fidel's work, have a country of science men. And that created the very basis of what the universities are today. But it's also seen as a period in which the knowledge was created very much on silos, like in different disciplinary spaces that not necessarily were interacting in a way that was more generative towards the rest of society. That changes quite a lot in the 90s with the whole special period and when the society started to, the need of the emergence of new nodes of collaboration that start to appear. But according to the interviews and the data, it seems to be very kind of punctual nodes of collaboration that is only in the last 10 years when it starts to be recognized and more institutionalized and somehow move to what one of our interviews says, from thematic packages to problematic packages. The idea that now knowledge needs to start be addressing not specific things, but wider problematic issues that need to be addressed both through the university and a series of actors collaborating. So what we decided to do in this mapping was to basically focus in this kind of third period and try to map a few moments in which the university has been collaborating with public actors through completely different institutional arrangements, sometimes with municipalities, with specific planning institutions, sometimes more disciplinary or territorial collaborations, and trying to understand, and as in the case of Freetown, the different instruments and tactics that had been used and had been successful in kind of creating these kind of synergies. Very quickly, I'm going to take you, I'm going to skip that. Very quickly, I'm going to take you to some of these synergies and tensions in the same way. I'm going to wrap up in 2 minutes. So there's also, of course, lots of synergies, and this happens both between students, residents, and the public institutions and the university. On the one hand, as we were listening yesterday from Gautam and Anand, there is a lot of gain for the students in engaging with the residents, but also for the public institutions to use the students as a workforce to produce material to map knowledge and to validate what they refer as popular knowledge, that is basically what the communities themselves have. This kind of translation happens in many ways, and the university has been able to promote methodologies such as festivals or other ways in which actually this kind of knowledge can travel from communities to the public sector. Now, if in the case of Freetown, many of the risks and challenges are emerging for the process of institutionalization, given that in Cuba you have a very long history of very strong institutions, the kind of process that we are looking at has to do with the opposite, how there are openings of flexibilization and opening of institutions. And we map a lot of interesting things that we have not the time to share with you now, of how some governance arrangement and structures are allowing the collaboration between municipalities and the university, and many experiences, especially outside Havana, extremely successful in provoking these kind of synergies. Now, when we go to the case of Havana, and this is particularly on one kind of unit working in the oldest part of Havana, this flexibilization on the one hand has allowed the necessary kind of methodological autonomy of the institution to collaborate, to generate this idea of laboratory in the territory. But of course, in the case of Havana, there are challenges related to the size of the city, to the big challenges, and also to these new actors that are appearing, and this new kind of the emergence of the private sector, of course, that not necessarily have this kind of mandate that the university is trying to promote in terms of urban equality, and that of course opens some risks. Just to wrap up, I'm sorry we are a couple of minutes late. We want to wrap up with a couple of reflections about what do we learn from this, no? Because as we say from the very beginning, we see this as a tool to other things. It's not just the mapping by itself. There is a series of strategies that we have been able to map in terms of common ways that different actors have used to mobilize and translate knowledge to advance in the urban equality agenda. I'm not going to go into detail, but it has to do with mutual validation and recognition of different capacities and different assets that different institutions have, and also with the capacity to mobilize those knowledges through different spaces, through different methodologies. And the idea is to then take these strategies and think back with our partners, okay, how are we making sure that the current research process is actually kind of mobilizing them in a way that is as productive as some of these experiences that we have met have been.
And with a very, very final note, thinking about how this links with the idea of urban equality, we think that there's a couple of things that this teaches us. So one is the multiple sites in which knowledge is produced and travels, and the conditions that are allowing this translation to happen over time. Secondly, as Camila mentioned, as an action research initiative, trying to understand how some of these strategies over time can be used as points of reflections with our partners to inform future research, future actions, drawing on this legacy that already exists. Third, thinking about this as a real sort of analysis of a slow anatomy of change over time, and tracing the kind of densities and clusters which thicken or around certain events. And we think this is really important in terms of challenging a kind of singular understanding of change. So perhaps around the heroic mayor, for example, or the moment of crisis, challenging that. And finally, thinking about, as a little bit of a warning, the enduring power asymmetries in knowledge production, and therefore the potential risks and challenges related to these clashes between particular governance structures that take place in very different ways in Freetown and Havana, and co-production processes.
So we're just going to go now straight into the next presentation, and we get, please take some notes around your questions, and we have the questions in the end. Professor Kombe and Professor Tato are going to introduce the next talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues. What we are going to present to you this morning is essentially an activity which we are investigating in Dar es Salaam, which is very much similar to what is happening in Havana and Sierra Leone. But essentially we are analyzing retrospectively a process of co-production that was applied in an analysis for a community in Dar es Salaam to deliver basic services, and trying to understand the trajectories which this project took and what are the lessons so far which we can draw from this one. We'll have the presentation in two parts. The first part, Dr. Tat will present and bring to the fore the methodological and the conceptual ideas, and then I'll come back out in terms of findings and the lessons of experience.
Good morning. Like Professor Kombe said, I'm going to take you through the first part of the presentation, which includes the basic background, the introduction, and the methodology. Just a moment. So to go straight into the presentation, this is familiar to most of us, the background of informality that is facing most of our cities in sub-Saharan Africa. And in Dar es Salaam in particular, we have the problems of informal settlements and the way they lack inadequate basic infrastructure services. And this is the backdrop of the project that we want to explain to you today. And we're also saying that annual spending on infrastructure services is far below the needs, and approximately about US 90 billion, but the expenditure is less than 2/3, especially in informal settlements. And we're saying that the informality that we're experiencing is characterized by widespread economic and social spatial inequalities that have significant gender dimensions. Obviously, women are more impacted by the lack of services. Another characteristic is that in most countries, the inequalities and the urban labor markets are characterized by dominance of low wages in informal economies, and most of the trading and the business that is done is basically home-based. Tanzania is ranked at 134th out of 148 countries in terms of quality of basic infrastructure. And this is manifested in the poverty and the urban inequalities that are pervasive. Our local and central governments are faced with inadequate resources, and this is a major impediment to the delivery of basic services. So we have had several responses to trying to upgrade the services in our countries. We've had the slum clearance and low-cost housing supply, which started in the 1960s, basically trying to improve the situation of our informal settlements. We've had the sites and services and squatter upgrading in the 60s and 70s. This was basically a provider model, top-down, but the idea was to increase service access through public-led, public-state sector initiatives. And then we went to the community infrastructure upgrading. This was in the 80s and 90s. This we termed an enabler model, trying to move from models that were basically public-led. And the idea was to improve with increased participation of local communities that was earlier not taken care of. So in terms of what has been happening in improving these settlements, there has been an increasing criticism of this kind of unidirectional model of knowledge generation. So it implies that we needed a more robust approach to services delivery. Both the provider-enabler model failed to address basically the structural issues, for instance, economic, political, and social cultural concerns. And we had the worsening condition of informal housing. Another criticism was that income and employment generation in the low-income communities was not addressed. Skills were not upgraded, nor was the knowledge that was existing in the informal settlement tapped. Again, there was inadequate resource capacities for the public sector, and this was coupled with demand for a multi-stakeholder engagement in public service delivery. So all these sort of unsuccessful attempts led to the idea of co-production, and in Hananasif this was taken up. Basically the characteristics of this response in Hananasif was partnership, collaborative, inclusive, and structural changes. So this leads us to our objective of the case in Hananasif. And the idea was to analyze and explain the nature of co-production processes in Hananasif. This is a kind of a retrospective study, like Professor said, and it focuses on the drivers and pathways that were applied, and that seemed to have made a difference in reducing inequalities in the low-income settlements in Hananasif. The second one was to analyze how co-production has changed the trajectories to urban equality, focusing on the drivers and pathways. So why Hananasif informal settlement? Hananasif was upgraded about 25 years ago. It underwent a complete project cycle, which gave us a chance to see what happened. Also, there was multi-stakeholder partnerships in the process throughout the conception, design, and implementation processes. And it also addressed social, cultural, and economic structural concerns in the community. So these were some of the reasons that made us choose Hananasif. It's a retrospective exploration in terms of methodology, because this was an activity that happened 25 years ago. We're trying to explore the co-production of basic infrastructure services. While when we went into the study, we did a pilot study. Expert and community consultation workshops were key to our process. We also had, or will also have, and this is something that is still going on, a project technical advisory committee team that audits and supports the research, including the data sources that we constantly come up with. And it's basically a qualitative study, and which is also followed by a quantitative survey. We did a survey of about 108 households. This is the location of Hananasif, and key is that Hananasif is about 3 to 4 kilometers from the central business district, so there's a lot of pressure in terms of location. People want to live near the city, but there's also a pressure in terms of the land value of Hananasif, which is quite high. Now, in terms of the conceptual premises or the underpinnings that have sort of shaped our study, we're rethinking the role of citizen, state, popular, and private sectors in the delivery of basic services, pulling together these diverse resources for knowledge, skills, practices, and policy actors. Also, what is key here is to see what the transformation of power relations, for instance, between the technocrats and the communities, what is happening, empowering actors, enhancing efficiency and the quality of life of public services. These are some of the concepts that we have borrowed from the researchers that we are telling you. We're also saying that it's a social learning process. Knowledge is applied through a two-way collaboration, recognizing that the community also has knowledge, tacit knowledge that is quite valuable. Another is the multi-level stakeholders, partnerships, pathways, and linkages, and we think these are very, very essential for shared responsibility in terms of a co-production process. So the key conceptual variables that we have unwrapped from this is that political platforms are necessary, social, cultural, and technical transformation, capacity building, and partnerships and interdependencies are all necessary variables for the co-production process in HANA-NASIF. So this brings us to the a sort of a conceptual framework that we came up with, showing that the co-production of basic community services in HANA-NASIF is built upon the political platforms, the social, cultural, and technical transformation that happened in the process, the partnerships and interdependencies, and the capacity building. So now I'll give this to Professor Kombe to continue with the findings that we took.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tatu. In terms of the finding, I wish to emphasize that the key drivers which we observed in HANA-NASIF were essentially the environmental challenges, which prompted the community to appeal for support from different sectors, including local government and central government. The community commitment to address the problem itself, to initiate the project, start contributing and making a difference, and the inadequate resources of the public sector, which calls for a partnership and soliciting partners to join the process. Next, please. Also, therefore, the squalid living conditions in the settlements, the frequent flooding, and the comments which were given by the respondents, like our children were frequently suffering from malaria and diarrhea. We sometimes had to take off our shoes and hold up our dresses to navigate in the neighborhood during rainy season, mud and whatnot. About 90% of the respondents complaining about this problem before the project was implemented. And what partnership and interest were observed in HANA-NASIF? One is that there are the community of HANA-NASIF which want to solve the problem of infrastructure, the environmental concern, the municipal which want to deliver services, international labor organization which want to test labor-based technology and create employment and low income to address the poverty in the settlements, or the university which want to use this as a learning laboratory, UNDP which was interested in supporting the poor in the settlements, city level authorities steering committee which was supposed to coordinate the multi-stakeholders composition, and UNDP and UN Habitat trying to emphasize partnership to improve informal settlements, and the regional authorities, district authorities as an institution to address conflicts which emerged here and there. Pathways, there are systems of mediating conflicts, facilitating, operationalizing partnership, which was critical, transfer of knowledge and skills, and knowledge between community and technical leaders or technical teams, men and women, training men and women in the city council, employees also, politicians' involvement, development partners. All these were meeting or were interacting through multiple political platforms and interdependence which were created at the different levels. At city level with the steering committee, at the municipal level we have the coordinating committees, at project level we had the project coordination committee, and we had also the CBO which had its own committee, and other women associations which are the microcredit facility and the waste collection systems organized by women groups. We also had the training capacity building process which was observed in terms of imparting knowledge and skills among community members, and in terms of the community contracting, leadership, basic bookkeeping and procurement. We also had issues of supporting the CBO to build it into a community-wide institution instead of becoming a group of few people. And then we observed also that the need to adapt or adapted the labor-based technology in order to optimize employment and income, particularly among the poor men and women, because the issue of poverty was very critical. And in the past, the use of the contractor-based approach, which is much machine-intensive, was being applied. The idea was tried with labor-based ways to create more employment to the community, and that's why it was supported by community capacity building. The other important thing was the intention to address the social-cultural problem in the society in terms of trying to equip women, especially who are marginalized in a very, let's put it, a Muslim society where women were not allowed to work in the construction sector, parallel with men, and these were trained and transformed through this process of intervention, including microcredit facility for engaging in business, and those which form groups to collect waste and charge accordingly. And this shows a summary of the web of co-production pathways network in the settlements, which were used to achieve the core delivery of services. The details of the interaction are in the report. Co-production, what are the key observations? Partnership of actors of different resource capacities facilitated delivery of services. However, many poor households have access to potable water supply following this change which took place. Before, they were relying on water from a single tap. Now, many houses have connected water to their houses. Spin-off from the co-production, including the microcredit facility, the Kimoda, the solid waste collection projects, have made a difference, especially among women who are involved in these activities, in terms of getting income, in terms of initiating new income and employment generation activities, the settlements. The technical skills imparted among unemployed women and men have enabled them to secure employment in the construction site within and outside the settlements, and the community infrastructure provided have enhanced property value, attracted more investment, and most important, have attracted other people to come into the settlement and support the community to improve their property value. Partners involved in the process are critical players. Co-production-based services that involve multiple stakeholders, varying capacities and power, involved in different pathways, require much more time, patience, and to know each other and appreciate one's inputs beyond the financial contribution. What we are saying is that our experience and observation is that it's not a matter of really meeting and sharing partnership. It needs a lot of time to understand each other, especially because there are varying interests which are involved. After the completion of the project, neither the city council nor the municipal councils has been taking interest in monitoring, in follow-up. Engineers from the municipal councils did not really seem to have interest despite involvement over a long time. This depicts a question of political will and technocratic inertia, which is very limited to transform. Many households have connected water to their household. I have no employment because I cannot sell water anymore because public kiosks have been abandoned. This was an interview with a lady who was employed to sell water, and she thought that this was a permanent job. Therefore, this issue of people connecting water to their houses has become a disadvantage. And this is a misconception which I must observe. We must observe that sometimes we initiate projects and the community does not understand adequately what it means in terms of long-term interest. Conclusions. What we are saying is that so far, spin-offs from the co-production process have enforced the outcomes beyond the project financial input and scope of activities which we intended to undertake in terms of co-production. The institutional and the human resource capacity building, the community and services delivered were key incentives that attracted additional input and interaction with other stakeholders beyond those who were in the project. Co-production project analysis, like other local development projects, operated within the socio-economic and institutional framework of local government. The idea was that after the end of the project, these institutions, local government will take them and embed the process into their developmental envelope in terms of routine support and the assimilation of the approach. This has not happened, suggesting little political will and bureaucratic inertia to to adapt and transform. One of the main lessons drawn is that rethinking co-production in a low-income communities require inward looking in terms of resources. There was a lot of outward looking in this project, getting tribe support from outside. We forgot about the inside. And this has happened already. We see a lot of local institutions which have come forward to assist, who could have been incorporated in the beginning. At the same time, building networks and a most important political will, assessing, integrating, and lobbying to get the political will should be very instrumental in co-production. What are the next steps? Co-production has changed the trajectories to urban inequality as observed in NASIF. However, the approach does not seem to have been deployed and scaled up significantly in the city or municipality. What the attributes of co-production have been used in those other projects where we want to go will be critical understanding to understand what happened, what aspects of cooperation have been selected, why, and what interests are driving those selections at the city level in terms of the project we are going to analyze. And therefore want to take a second case study where we are going to do analysis based on a project which have been implemented without adapting this concept adequately. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll be hearing now from Vanessa Castambroto and Catalina Ortiz, people they've done together with Cassidy Johnson, some of their work related to the some of the work related to the No project as well around co-production. So, thank you. Barbara, because in the program is Barbara
Hello.
and Emmanuel also part of the paper. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is a co-produced paper. So we are going to just share part of the work that the Work Package 1 has been doing in No. I think the main assumption that our team is using is that we have the imperative to locate the co-production of knowledge as a catalyst to really push forward for emancipatory agendas in the city-making process of the cases and the partners we're working with. So in that regard, we are going to present 4 key elements of the process we are doing. One is trying to locate and take a stock of how the different debates in the academic realm is taking into consideration co-production, given kind of the blossoming literature and interest in this now becoming a buzzword. So in a way, we are fighting to going beyond the buzzword problem. Second, we are going to be acknowledging and deploying what are the pitfalls and the critiques also that has been around surrounding co-production. To give rise to, in the third instance, to explain some of the propositions that we are in a way putting forward and trying to analyze with you. And fourth, we are going to be sharing a very provisional and initial guide to understand what are the patterns and trends in analyzing what are our partners doing. So we start doing a general understanding of how all the different directions and trajectories that our partners are teaching us. And I think something that is very interesting for us is understanding this idea of co-production in the interaction of 3 logics. The logic of accountability, so in other words, how the traditional academic agents have also the duty to make an impact, and that's why, in a way, the impact is something that is very important for us. And in that regard, what is the logic of impact that each one of our partners is taking into consideration? But most importantly, how are we deploying a logic of humility? And how we challenge the expertise and how can we bring that to the fore in our work? Oh, sorry. So basically, we are trying to answer how does then co-productions contribute to urban equality, and for doing that, as I was saying, we try to map out what our colleagues in different disciplines have been understanding and about co-production. And we, of course, found that It was public administration, perhaps with the work with Eleanor Ostrom, that was a pioneer in bringing these ideas about eco-production, but how sustainability science and environmental studies have been the ones, in a way, leading part of the discussions, and how the use of co-production has been linked nowadays to the idea of global sustainability. So I think it's interesting to see how the scale of the use of co-production has been also understood in a more planetary basis. So challenging also many of the words that are very localized and in a way located only in kind of neighborhood scale. Of course, development studies is the one that has been championing a lot, and we're very familiar with the use of co-production. The work of Diana Mitlin, that most of you are very familiar with, is also helping us to understand how social movements have been using social co-production in order to transcend the contentious politics of confrontation in different places. And the work of our very Vanessa and other colleagues have also teaching us about the imperative of understanding intersectionality and the challenges that it brings when we think of production through the lenses of intersectionality. And echoing what one of the key challenges that Karen pushed us to think about in the first day. Urban planning, on the other hand, has been connecting these ideas of co-production to how are we framing urban governance, and how, in a way, it relates as well with the different participatory governance mechanisms that has been for long term discussed within urban planning. Critical geography, on the other hand, is also helping us to understand and contest the ideas of the politics of expertise. And I think that is something that we really need to be taking into consideration to understand also co-production in tandem with processes of resistance in the city. And I think from cultural studies, it's a very interesting and growing work in understanding how co-production is also part of the new geographies of how, for instance, practices of public art are coming about. So going beyond the traditional development studies discussions. But of course, these different disciplinary discussions are also allowing us to understand and map out what are the different gaps that has been encountered in these different fields. On the one hand, environmental science is not tackling at all urban equality. It's of course focusing on sustainability, but urban equality and the urbanity of the discussion is not at the center of its concerns, and that's why we think particularly this project needs to be very clear in understanding and contributing how the political economy of the city needs to be understood through the lenses of co-production. Also, development studies are suggesting us that we need to really keep pushing for understanding and making a more clear operationalization of intersectionality when we deal with co-production. Urban planning is also suggesting us that the global south theoretical perspectives need to bring to the fore, and that the discussions about participatory governance has been very led by the northern perspectives as we know it. Critical geography also suggests that sometimes co-production debates forget in engaging resistance agendas, and how co-production and resistance in a way need to be also thought in a conjunction. And cultural studies remind us and also allow us to think how embodiment affect and other epistemes outside the argumentative real need to be introduced to the processes of thinking co-production processes. And therefore, this is allowing us to think and in a way expand the Nancy Fraser perspective in terms of understanding the different facets of urban equality, and bringing to the center ideas of epistemic and restorative justice, learning from different strategies and big debates that have been around in terms of the colonial thinking, feminist thinking, and that I think is something that we feel that should be or could be the contribution where we can place our conceptual and theoretical work. But what do we need co-production for? And I think for answering this question, we need to acknowledge the different critiques and pitfalls that different people have been showing us in terms of understanding also the shortcomings of participatory governance. And I think we need to understand that co-production in a way is an extension or is aligned with a long-term idea of doing governance that is embedded in a trajectory of emancipatory thought. So just to point 5 key critiques that you can encounter in the participatory literature is that we have to be aware in not just becoming part of this post-political world and in a way placing co-production as yet another way of doing technopolitics. And I think the work of Eric Singwendau is very interesting and important for us. Of course, has been also the critique of how many times co-production has been used as part of the neoliberal approach, where it becomes a strategy to dissolute the state responsibility and yet giving another responsibility to people that are already struggling to live and make means in the city. That also supports this idea of the illusion of the consensus, and in a way Chantal Mouffe and his work has reminded us of understanding the agonistic approach when we deal with the politics of the city. But also, and I think this is aligned with the critiques or this imperative of engaging with intersectionality, the work of our very colleague Andrea Rigon, for instance, is very important for us in understanding why we cannot keep homogenizing communities and what are the risks and the dangers of doing so. And of course, the limited effectiveness of doing co-production and to what extent the deployment of participation is just becoming a fashionable term that keeps developing the industry of development going. So I think those are key reminders for us in order to not to do that and how to really make co-productive process aligned to other agendas. So with that, I leave my colleague to tell you what the propositions we are doing.
Wow. Hello. I look a lot better with a microphone, I must say. So I actually, sorry for the little correction, but I would say it's not that these participatory debates are things that we don't have to do, but they are almost things that we cannot escape. So I think what I want to do is to do not 5, but 6 propositions, so 5 and 1 extra on knowledge co-production. There's my attention to detail very on display. And first of all, starting, what we were saying is, what can we learn from the work of our colleagues? And what can we learn in the sense that, can we make a series of a bit of controversial statements about co-production to try to define and try to deepen what co-production of knowledge brings to us? And obviously, starting with this thing is that it's not that we are discovering the wheel. Knowledge co-production is not new, and for many of us, knowledge co-production comes on a large trajectory of emancipatory thinking that relates to participatory and collaborative research. But also, this participatory and collaborative research cannot escape these dilemmas that are well documented in the literature. But what does make co-production different and special? And it was actually discussing with our team, with our colleagues from RD, when we were in Kampala, that we all came to this conclusion that the one thing that they are seeing there is that knowledge co-production, unlike some strands of participatory research and participatory planning, involve the production of a concrete outcome, which is shared by all participants. So, for example, those outcomes relate to for us, we want to think about what these urban equality outcomes will be in terms of equitable distribution, parity political participation, and reciprocal recognition. And here you have some of the ways we try to conceptualize those outcomes a bit more in detail, in a spatial way, trying to bring, as Catalina was saying from the literature, that kind of spatial aspects of urban equality. If we look at the work of our colleagues, the kind of outcomes that we see are incremental improvements to livelihoods, regulatory changes, making things visible, So this is the way we conceptualize those three aspects of urban equality. And we can see how the outcomes don't emerge in any part of those axes, but actually at the interaction of the work of those axes. So for example, our Lima colleagues, one of the things they are trying to do is to create regulatory changes that impact directly on the livelihoods of the people living in the periphery of Lima. Our colleagues in Kampala, for example, are trying to make visible how the processes of building briquettes may bring those incremental improvements to the livelihoods of people in Kampala. Our colleagues from CCI in Dar es Salaam, you saw yesterday how they were using the framework on prosperity to try to understand how communities understood prosperity to make that visible, to make regulatory changes. So what we discovered in our debates with the RD team was that, well, that's short, was that actually most of the outcomes that we find from these participatory processes, they don't refer to any one dimension or to any two dimensions of this, but they often are a composite of many, many outcomes, and you saw it in the previous presentation. So there are different aspects that become important during that process. And at the end, sometimes those outcomes become a bit diffused on the way that they have contributed to different aspects of urban equality. So perhaps we found that mapping those outcomes only would not be easy. The third proposition that I want to propose is that knowledge co-production requires particularly thinking about the whereabouts of knowledge. And that again challenges our thinking about both outcomes and both the process of co-production. So, for example, traditionally, so we think about the knowledge is something that is transmitted. And what a lot of this radical emancipatory tradition of thinking about knowledge has done is to rethink and to say, well, this is not anymore a transmission from some sort of expert, normally a male and white expert somewhere, who transmits some knowledge to some community, but rather communities themselves have something to contribute, and it should be this expert who is learning from these communities. So you see that knowledge is located, but that still is transmitted. So it's transmitted from the expert to the community or from the community to the expert. I would argue that neither of these models is correct. That's not really what happens. Of course, there's something in the community. I'm not saying that, but what I'm object is to this idea of knowledge moving around. More sophisticated narrations about co-production, they would say, well, perhaps this expert also has something to say, and what we want is to have a reciprocal exchange between whatever knowledge the community has and whatever knowledge somebody who calls himself an expert will have. I would argue that that's also not what happens. Yeah, I'm going to take maybe a couple of minutes more. And finally, you will have another approach that would say, perhaps what we need to do is to bring the knowledge from the expert, the knowledge from the communities, and work a process together and facilitate that integration. Well, I still would argue that's not what happens. And you would say, maybe it's that we are not representing the expert, so we could have a completely different expert, like somebody like Shirley Chisholm, a black radical feminist, for example, or somebody else. Still, it doesn't matter how you conceptualize the expert. Still, there's not an expert that has a knowledge that gives it, and no matter how much we respect that person or group of persons. And also we could say, well, it's maybe the diversity of the community. You are not reflecting on the variety of processes and the variety of groups. Well, that's true as well, but that's not my point. My point would be that knowledge is something else. Knowledge is not something that passes from one place to another. Most of all, there is not such a thing as an ownership of knowledge. Nobody actually owns the knowledge. Knowledge is something that is shared. So Doina Petrescu, who is an architect in Sheffield, she says that knowledge is socially constructed and it is therefore situated and affected by the social position of the producer of everyday life, and challenges the dominant viewpoint and provides partial visions which are subjective, embodied, and diverse. So I would say knowledge, if anything, is a relationship. And knowledge co-production requires new interpretations that do not belong to any one single actor, but that can be mobilized for all. And that's really important, and that really challenges a lot of the processes that we do in co-production. I would say politically and strategically, you may want to be careful about this because you don't want to go around saying maybe communities don't have knowledge, because actually politically it's very complicated to explain sometimes why communities have to be paid attention to. And in my own work about climate adaptation, a lot of the work I do is to say, well, the expertise that communities have often is life-saving, and is what builds resilience, and is what helps adaptation. But nevertheless, theoretically and with a critical mind, we should be reflective about where is that knowledge and how knowledge is a relationship. So I'm very quickly going to my last propositions. One is that knowledge co-production in particular uses a knowledge outcome to challenge hegemonic power. So Alex was saying that we often take for granted the normative orientation of our work. I do very strongly. But then we have to think a bit the possibilities of that knowledge to challenge that hegemonic knowledge. And there, Catalina and I have been discussing this work of Simin Dabodi, who is a planner, she's based in the UK, but she's saying that planning is actually a practice of knowing. And that moves us to think that perhaps planning can give us an insight into how we can mobilize that knowledge co-production to actually deliver some urban equality outcomes. And in that context, we have to think about that this process of knowledge co-production, whatever knowledge co-production is maybe not that different from the co-production of services, and that the co-production of services has at its core this co-production of knowledge, and the co-production of knowledge always happens before than co-production of services. So this was something that became very obvious to me in a recent work that I've been doing with the Karachi Urban Lab, also within the No project, in which we were looking at how we can apply an intersectional perspective on a knowledge co-production process. And what that shows is that if we wanted to produce a service that was reducing of the impact of urban violence on the most vulnerable populations of the city, the first thing we had to do was to understand how that violence was being produced and what different forms of reactions were happening, but also, very crucially, how the research team was interacting with the very people that were involved in the team. And I can explain about that a bit more later. And very crucially, if we go back to that image of the expert of and the community, we would all like to break that down and say that doesn't exist. But I think Autham's presentation yesterday was very informative in the sense that he reminded us that when we are based at universities, or when we are based in particular institutions, we still are part of that hegemony of knowledge. We still are part of the people who have like the possibility of constructing certain knowledge and verifying that event. So if knowledge is a relationship that is producing, we are able to steer that boat to produce that knowledge. And therefore, that gives us an extra responsibility when we are doing knowledge co-production. We cannot withdraw from that responsibility and just sit down. For example, a lot of knowledge co-production research focuses on documenting social movements over the years, and I think that's very valuable, but that's not knowledge co-production, right? That's social movements, and that's something different than what co-production is. Co-production has to have that intent and that outcome. Maybe that's a bit polemic, hopefully it is. So building on the planning literature and the different forms of knowledge, yes, just my last two slides. I will, I'm so sorry about this. I'm really sorry. We found these 6 strategies, which actually, again, when we visited the project in Kampala, they became really, the one about briquette making, they became really evident about the idea of appropriating the very spaces that are in the city, the very structures of the state, particularly in Kampala, this reclaiming. These are public space appropriation strategies or public space creation strategies, but I think they can be applied very well, particularly following the tradition of Ostrom, to think about the urban commons and how we deal with the urban commons. And in Kampala, for example, reclaiming waste as a way of making fuel, I think is a very transgressive act. But also pluralizing, thinking about, for example, from the perspectives of critical race theory and intersectionality, about how we are thinking about the different groups in the city who is marginalized, transgressing both cultural and institutional boundaries, uncovering and making visible what's happening, and contesting. So what we've done is trying to map the work that our colleagues do in terms of the different dimensions of urban equality and the different ways we can relate knowledge, the making of knowledge, through a co-production process with different ways of transforming urban space. And we can discuss that over the time. But I think that table, what it starts to show is that when we are doing knowledge co-production, we are not contesting a space. We are doing a lot of other things, but perhaps there are more other classical ways of thinking about this insurgent planning and about urban planning, which are not considered within the co-production process. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. We're now going to our last presentation, and Vikas John and Priya Singh are going to make a presentation about planning trajectories. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. So I just want to, we'll begin with, just to give you a sense of how the presentation is going to go. I'll just set the context in which this study was situated, and Priya will take us through some of the data that's emerging in multiple contexts that we are out there in the field. And then we'll sort of close with initial reflections and open it up really to discussion and to sort of talk through and I guess reflect back on how inquiry could sort of help us think about a very qualitative, contextualized approach to understanding equity and equality in very particular educational spaces. So the idea of the study was, sorry, I'm losing my. Oh, so we are part of Work Package 5, and what this study was intended to do or intends to do right now is to look at the idea of urban equalities as they emerge in the narratives and experiences of folks going through education and urban planning. So it is contextualized within higher education spaces, and it looks particularly at student and alumni trajectories and looks at their experiences and their negotiations of values and larger value systems. So what we thought, and just to sort of, before I get into this slide, the framing of this paper sort of looked at the idea of the ways in which equity and equality are inherent or exhibited comes because of certain types of within certain types of contextualized spaces where multiple nodes of influence work on personal experiences. And because this is particularly higher education spaces, what we were looking at was the idea of the discipline itself, the curriculum within the discipline, and the various kinds of social dynamics which play out within higher education spaces that influence an interpretation and the execution of value systems. What we did was choose a very qualitative, individualized, semi-structured interview process, and we try to understand experiences, backgrounds, choices, motivations, challenges, and as well as the different kinds of negotiations students and alumni, while speaking about student as well as current experience, talk about. So what I would like to also sort of to begin with is to think about how the idea of where the idea of framing an inquiry comes from, and as for this study particularly, as it emerged through a lot of extant literature, the categories of alumni, student, and trajectories themselves have an inbuilt assumption in them, and in most cases actually tend to be this linear structured process in which imagines sort of a chronological growth process. in our own, what we're looking at or what we're seeing right now in the narratives that are coming through is that this process is not as linear or as structured. And this assumption is troubled through the lived experiences. And most of these are unstructured moments. These are opportunistic and these are strategic. Priya over here will help us go through some of the data that's coming through, and through these vignettes we'll try and sort of illustrate these kind of this central point of this paper, and sort of look at how particular types of dichotomies help us understand this process.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So we started the study by trying to understand why the respondents with whom we interacted, they came into the practice of planning, like the education and the practice. And what we saw was, so these are parts of the codes that we got from various respondents, and it was very clear in some of the cases that for some respondents, there were different aspects that were important to them, and it wasn't always, say, the love for the discipline in itself. And various considerations came into the picture, like the perception of the institution from which they studied, or an ambiguity of the discipline itself. So for one of the respondents, we saw it was the respondent in question did their undergraduation in environmental engineering, and they had a very different understanding of what the discipline would be like. And it was only after once they started the course, they thought, oh, this was not what I thought the course would teach me. But they continued with it and ended up in the practice of planning. For some other respondents, what came was for some of them we saw that planning wasn't their first discipline preference. It was either design or architecture, but because they wanted to study at a particular institution because of the social capital the institution carried, they let go of their discipline of choice and chose the institution of choice. So this was interesting because in these cases we saw that the university space and the city held a higher value for the people than the discipline itself. And finally, we got a few, to get an understanding as to why that happened, was a lot of social value was attached to getting into a particular university, and to have a social standard and a social capital, people all at times they prioritized getting into an institution than the discipline of choice. Another aspect that we noted among the respondents was the concept of language. So language came out as an important part of the experience for different people, and it worked in different ways for the respondents. Like for someone, language worked as something they needed to be proficient in order to succeed in the market of planning, whereas for others it became important as an entity of its own. So what we saw was, so for one of the respondents, the lack in proficiency in English language particularly was mapped against an idea of what the market needs. So he, in a global landscape, because English proficiency was required to, in a way, share your thoughts and ideas, you needed to be proficient in a particular language and not always communicate in a language in which, say, you've done majority of your education in. For other of the respondents, they had a different issue with language in the field of urban design. So some of the respondents came from other disciplines, so the language of the discipline was something very new for them, and they had to interact and experience with them. So for them, so they often had to use things like graphic modes of representation to communicate their idea, because among the masses, the proficiency of, say, the design of urban language or urban planning wasn't very clear. And finally, what we saw was the distinction between the local language and the language in which they studied a discipline. So for some of the respondents, what we saw was in their school, English was taught in the local language. So for one of the respondents in Tanzania, they learned English in Swahili, but they had to practice it in English, and so there was like the curriculum was in English, so they had to make a lot of adjustments there because they didn't have the level of proficiency that was required at the university level. For others, once they, after studying a curriculum in planning in English, when they came to practice, they saw that the local language was used a lot more than English language, and despite knowing the local language, they didn't know the technical terms. So interacting with those languages became an issue for them. So overall, it was evident from the narratives that language and language skills were an important pivot point for the respondents across the board. However, the language was different for different respondents. As for some, it was the language of a discipline, and for some, it was the textual language and the experiences they had with it. Then we also, one of the distinctions that we saw was the private and the government side of practice. So the choices between being in government and private practice appeared to be a highly negotiated space, and it presented several challenges for the respondents. One of the first quote is from a respondent. So she was in the field of academics for almost 11 years. She did her PhD in planning, but she ultimately moved into private practice to look at the other side of what she can contribute, not just as an academic, but by being a user of the models that the researchers in the field have developed for so long. The second quote is by a respondent who never wanted to work in the public sector because of the challenges inherent in the public sector. He said he could never see himself working there because of red tape or inability to always voice your views, and he continued to stay in the field of academics because that provided more leeway in terms of what you want to communicate. Next, what we saw was, so this quote were from two respondents we interacted with in Thailand, and they talked about corruption being somewhat inherent in the government structure, which always demotivated many people to go and work in the public sector, and they preferred rather being in private sector, working with foreign dignitaries and rather than working with the people in their own government. So this is more of a descriptive slide. Till now, like the slides had quotations, this is more of an analysis between what we saw, like how the respondents reacted with the concepts of city and other regions. So what some of the things that became a little clear was the choice of discipline between the students living in the city and coming from the outskirts was different. So in Thailand, what we noted was architecture, medicine, or engineering appeared to be somewhat of a tier 1 academic, like choice of discipline, whereas in disciplines like planning or design came out as a tier 2 choice of discipline. And so students from Bangalore had, from the city of Bangkok, they had access to different tutorials that they could attend and tuitions, classes that they could take, which made it easier for them to get into these courses. So when we looked at the class makeup, in tier 1 courses, we saw majority, almost 80% of the students were from the city of Bangkok, whereas for other courses like planning, most of the students came from outskirts. Not just that, students, as good universities carry certain social value, people wanted to get the social value, so they traveled to the city from the outskirts. And in a way, since they couldn't always get into the most popular courses, they settled for less popular courses just to study in a particular university. And thirdly, what we while interacting with the respondents, we got a sense that people coming from outskirts generally had a more human approach to the problem. Because they've lived in the outskirts, they haven't always had access to modern amenities all the time. They were more closer to the problem, hence were a step closer while coming up with a solution for those problems. And this came from their lived experiences. Whereas people from the city were to some extent ignorant to the outskirts spaces, unless those places were popular tourist destinations. And finally, the people in practice, in planning practice, always noted that it was much more difficult to realize a plan in the city because a majority of stakeholders were involved and interacting with all of them was always an issue, whereas in the outskirts it became more or less convenient to realize the plan that they've designed.
Okay, so just to conclude on this, I just want to reiterate that we are in sort of very initial stages of analysis and work, and we intend to go back into the field for more data collection. But the idea that the particular types of dichotomies that are emerging in lived experiences, they show up in very sort of nodal moments, things like the way students across different types of sites engage with language, how they imagine the idea of what is global and what is local, and the ways in which they see trajectories of working in the private sector versus working in the government sector, and so these dichotomies, in a way, are sort of the post within which the negotiations of lived experience happen, and the larger discourse also within research and within popular discourse situates them in very particular ways, and which is what which informs the research inquiry. However, these lived experiences sometimes speak to and sometimes speak against those kind of narratives and those kind of structured positionalities that emerge in extant literature and what we understand about individual experiences. And the one other point that I think I'll leave with is, because it comes from a sort of a very individual and contextualized space, the idea of how does that speak to the larger understanding of equality and equity for higher education spaces? How do we imagine higher education itself, the site of higher education, as a site of co-production, so to speak, of those kind of values? And I'll leave it over there, and we can pick up some of this during Q&A. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. We have some final remarks from Michele Acuto that is going to try to bring all of those different presentations together. So thank you, Michele.
Yeah, sure, in 2 minutes or less. Way to throw me in the deep end. No, look, I'm not going to try and summarize anything. Thanks, everyone. That was, does that work? I can shout otherwise. It was incredibly rich, so there's no point in trying to summarize anything in particular. And I genuinely do think that the paper / presentation / agenda / manifesto by Vanessa, Catalina, and co does do quite a lot of justice to sort of trying to bring some of this together. So hopefully that becomes a bit of a common resource. The lots of the rest can be read through in my mind. I think 2 things I wanted to sort of pick up that I found from my perspective, I guess, sort of cutting across most of the issues that you raised them. And one comes from what Steph and Camilla were talking about and what they were showing. And I think one of the things that if we take it a bit more from an intersectionally emancipatory kind of perspective, one of the values of some of what we've seen here is not just simply recognizing important strategies or I guess sort of intersections or specific moments, but the variety of the strategies and pathways that coexist and all happen at the same time, and there's a whole politics of that sort of playing in the background in lots of the cases, even sort of in the engaging with different sort of types of students and lived experiences. That to me the variety there becomes quite critical, precisely because as sort of Vanessa and Kata were talking about, there's a bit, not just a problem of the buzzword, but I think really important that sort of being conscious of the downside and the shortcoming of imposing, I guess, sort of a unitary framework, whichever that framework is, of co-production. I think there's a lot to be learned about the value of multiple things happening at the same time, and I guess from the perspective of, I guess how you put it in terms of sort of not the reflexivity, but the exercise of responsibility of a large international program or internationally mobile academics of various sorts. the exercise of caution in fact, not breaking apart or devaluing the variety of the strategies by our own intervention is critical in there. And I think so that made me think, sort of, I guess, from a work package for type perspective, that in fact, the fact that the two case studies don't quite gel with each other and you sort of had to tweak it a bit, or the fact that, so as the other case studies show, it's a good thing that these things don't fit neatly into boxes, and perhaps we should be much more explicit about advocating for the multiplicity of that. And in that, I guess I find it fabulous that you're teasing out Vikas and Priya at the end, sort of that you put it beautifully, the fact that the field, or I guess the subjects of the inquiry speak back to the neat structures of inquiry and say, well, this is not quite working. And I think we could do something a bit more explicit about empowering their reaction back in saying this doesn't quite work, or it doesn't work in multiple cases in the same, even in the same context at different historical junctures. So I think for me there, sort of the multiplicity and being much more explicitly advocates of that does play, I presume. Unfortunately, I didn't listen to it, and I will always be told off that I didn't listen to Karen's presentation at the beginning because I wasn't physically in the country, but I would presume that the international intersectional ethos there is precisely avoiding congealing specific forms of co-productions and I guess sort of legitimizing that those are the dominant ones, because we are ourselves sort of conduits of legitimizing that. And I guess I'll leave it at that, not to sort of bring up anything in particular, but I do think sort of that we can do something much more sort of collective in picking up the propositions that Vanessa and Kata had and playing with across the whole bit. I'll leave it at there because I'm sure the questions are more important.
We have time for one round of questions. We have one hand there, Colin.
Is this working? Yes, oh, it's working. That's right. Thank you. That was really amazing. All the presentations are really, really like thought-provoking and rich. I got a couple of reactions that I've just asked the panel if they might consider. One is around a couple of terms that came up a few times. One was consciousness. I think this might have been in the first paper, but also the mindsets, which I think Tatu and Kombi talked about, mindsets. And this kind of idea came up a lot, that kind of the notion of consciousness or mindset. And I'm wondering what that is. I mean, it's not knowledge, right? It's not just knowledge. It might be a product of co-production, it might not be. But I'm wondering how important it is for a successful program of work or project to have this kind of shift in consciousness. Like, how crucial is that? And where does it kind of fit in sort of the narrative that Catalina and Vanessa, for example, were outlining, or in the discussion of like planning and practice we had at the end? That's one thing. Another kind of reaction is around some of the related terms, justice and equality. This is particularly perhaps a question for Catalina and Vanessa. I'm just wondering how we kind of differentiate some of these terms that we're using. Is justice and equality for you guys, is it interchangeable, or does it point to different kinds of trajectories? Does it mean different forms of co-production? And just finally, there was something about translation running through all of this, which I thought was fascinating, because I was kind of thinking about where it's such a deeply political process, translation. But I sometimes feel like we fall into a conversation about translation that it's either successful or it's a failure. It's either happened or it hasn't happened. And I was wondering, wouldn't it be fantastic, and it felt like all the papers were doing this, to kind of produce a typology of translation that was kind of similar to the typology we saw from Catalina and Vanessa about different forms of knowledge and co-production. Like, how could we start to unpack that horrible academic word? Sorry, I apologize for the use of unpack. I withdraw that word immediately. But can we start to think about different kinds of translation and what they do in relation to different forms of co-production and different forms of equality? that may be over academicizing the discussions, but thank you, really excellent presentation.
Thank you. I'll echo Colin. It was a wonderful set of presentations and very thought-provoking. My question is specifically for Camilla and Stephanie. And it's really on, I mean, I think in your work, it was really nice to see kind of the mapping of knowledge, the deployment of tactics, all of that. I want to hear a little bit more on your own reflections of your positionality, because I guess the work that you're doing is also kind of generating an additional layer of knowledge on top of the knowledges that you're mapping. And if you could speak a little bit to if you kind of in your work encountered any of the kind of the silences that Colin was speaking about yesterday, the uncommunicable, the untranslatable, kind of in your work with Slurk and Kuhai in Havana. I mean, if you, yeah, just.
Any final question, Barbara?
On that is, again, very interesting unpacking, sorry to use that word, but it very much was unpacked of this knowledge translation. How much of that is being co-produced, and how much, so it's very much a reflection back on your question, how much of it is you, I don't know, reflecting back on these processes?
Great. One more? Is there one more there? We're picking up questions are good as a mode of commenting as well, not necessarily to be answers. So,
thanks to all. Very, very quick question on the notion of translation. I just would welcome some insights or reflections from the panel on how useful and productive do you find the notion, or are you finding the notion of translation as a way of precisely tackling many of the gaps, shortcomings, problems that we have with the notions of co-production and so on. So I guess that, for instance, the idea of translating something from one language to another, from one field to another and so on, somehow can also solidify the idea that there are particular sites which might be homogenized, have different levels of authority and so on, which I know you are fighting this idea. So I just want to share some reflection on that. Thank you.
great. I will ask the panelists to keep their answers short so that everybody has a chance to maybe get some reflections from the questions. You want to start?
Okay, because they were very simple questions, it's going to be very easy to keep it short. Okay, so starting with the question from Shreya and Barbara that I think are quite related. It has been an extreme challenge there, and when we started this idea that we are doing this process of researching and supporting, and like kind of we are, it's an extremely kind of, it's a process of extreme reflexivity, no? Like kind of what we are doing, it seems to, it aims to change what we are researching. So that has been extremely challenging, both methodologically, but also intellectually, in terms of how do we address it. And I think most of the work that we have done in this idea of finding some spaces, defining for ourselves some limits of what we are looking at has to do with that. And of course, that has been only possible with as much as possible, very close collaboration with the partners. This particular kind of more final shaped like mapping is something that we have just kind of produced in the last few weeks after a very intense collaboration with the partners. So I couldn't say like this particular mapping is something that has been necessarily very much co-produced, but the whole kind of definition of the targets, the impact, that's the impact strategy, and the definition of the fields that what had to be mapped was very much co-produced. And then the kind of follow-up process, as you know, we are halfway through the project, is about taking this back as a tool to work together, to unpack it, to see how useful it is and how it can be translated into something that is actually useful. So I don't know if that addressed very much. And then the question about consciousness, I think the way in which we are using it, and I think it relates to many of the questions about knowledge and translation that we are looking at. It has to do with the idea that probably following up of what Vanessa and Katarina were presenting, of challenging also the idea that knowledge is not necessarily created through some of these processes, but many of the knowledges exist, and they are like tacit in some spaces, in some areas. And the idea of translation for us has become like an entry point to discuss how those knowledges that exist enter into a kind of a relational way to each other. And then when we use the idea of consciousness, particularly in the Freetown timeline, we are talking about those moments in which those kind of relational relational spaces of knowledge appear, and we use that word of consciousness of like the idea of collectivizing the understanding of some knowledges that probably exist in some spaces, but then are mobilized through other. So I don't know if it's the best word, but I think that's the kind of the distinction that we are making there. I'm going to stop that. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add a very few points on that. And I think for us, it's been a really interesting couple of days because we've been reflecting and talking a lot about many of the discussions that have come before and how that informs what we're thinking about now. And so I think maybe that's some of the things that I'd bring up. So, for instance, thinking about our own positionality, and particularly around also the silences and the untranslatable, we kind of joked, but also talked very seriously around this idea Colin brings up of singularity, and in very practical ways, how that plays out in very different cases. So, in fact, we were thinking about untranslatable, both obviously looking through similarities through different cases, but also what's particular and what's situated in those two different cases that actually telling those narratives are very difficult in a comparative way. So I think that's something that's really been sort of troubling us or sort of on our mind or kind of pushed us to think a little bit differently. Also, yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, it is this very interesting relationship of both researching and impacting. And so the narratives that we highlight in this case are very reflective of a particular perspective. And you could enter to the case of Freetown, you could enter to the case of Havana and tell a very different story. In Freetown, for example, you could focus on a whole range of different things linked with colonial legacy of planning, for example. You could look at the way in which the local government structures have narrated this story of upgrading over time. But in a way, we were centering the positions and the visions of Slurk in the case of Freetown or of Kuhai, for example. And that sort of, I think we need to be quite explicit that then what we're showing is very representative of a very particular perspective and situated understanding of that history and time. The other thing, maybe I'll just say very quickly, is that we've really been pushed on and that we liked very much, Adriana, was your idea of knowledge traveling. And I think when we're trying to understand what these interfaces are and what is actually happening in those moments, it's that idea of knowledge being traveled from one space to another, from some actors to another, or different scales, for us has been a way of thinking through this idea of translation and thinking through what co-production means in this translation process. Yeah, sorry.
I don't think there was a specific question to ask, but I think I would share some issues about the consciousness and mindset. I think our understanding and our observation in the case study is that there was no really, in our opinion, and from the finding and discussion with all levels of participatory people who were involved, there was no really conscious appreciation of what this co-production would lead to, and what would therefore be very important to take into account in the design, in the implementation, and in the engagement through the platforms. It would appear that a lot of this thinking which was applied in the case study was kind of based on eventual expectation that this will work, without a preconceived idea of what this co-production means, what it entails in terms of institutional, political, and socio-economic imperatives of getting it done. And therefore, I would say that for us who have been involved in that process, and that's why we are able to make these insights, we see it as a kind of flaw in the design, flaws in the conception, and also misconception or thinking of it more or less as a upgrading project and not a co-production process. And this conscious, and that's why when you look even at the mindset of the technocrats who are supposed to roll out the process at the city level, at the municipal level, this has not happened. When you look at the political environment where this was supposed to happen, this has not happened significantly. That's why I want to interrogate other cases to find out what is actually being selected out of these processes which took place in this case study. And therefore, I would say that it is still a process we are studying, but I think there are already indications that there are quite a number of challenges which have emerged. I don't know whether Dr. Tat want to add something.
Just a small thing to go down to the ground when we talk about mindsets and the way we use the word in our study. We know that the labor-based technology process is very down to earth. It's right at the ground, and the engagement with the community is very, very intense. And you have the community, the unskilled workers, and you have the engineers working. So some of the stories that came out, there was a lot of conflict between the engineers and the community, but then there was also some change in terms of mindsets from the engineers. There were some who could not cope with working with the community down at the ground and the conflict between their skills and the experiences of the community. But there were engineers that were willing to transform, willing to go down and learn from the community. In spite of the fact that they were unskilled, but they had experiences, there were some engineers who narrated the transformations that they went through. So we say that there was at least some kind of mindset change that went on.
Thank you very much. So many comments, it's a bit difficult to prioritize, but perhaps on the notion of translation, my view would be that knowledge is not any place in particular, but it's actually an event. It's made in a particular event. We can try to solidify that in a published output or in something, and that gives that knowledge a bit of weight. But in the end, somebody's always reading, somebody's always remaking that knowledge and putting it forward. And I think that's a bit of a problem, and it also impacts a lot on communication. And on that note, and following on from Tatu's comments, I think in addition to consciousness and mindset, I think subconsciousness is also very important. And perhaps to give an example that is also an act of contrition, I corrected Catalina. I felt really embarrassed about it now, and it's shaping everything I'm doing, right? Because it's really not something I wanted to do. But and that subconscious of me and that thing is shaping everything I do. So why would we think that people in communities that come to the coproduction exercises or whatever that we do, and they come with the whole stories and their whole lives, which are beautiful and full of complexity, and they come there and they bring them, and they are very much a strong part of all the debates and all the dialogues and the actually making of knowledge that is happening there. And that's also true for whoever has a technocratic mindset. Whoever has a technocratic mindset has a series of affections and a series of attachments with different things that shape what they feel they can say and what they feel they cannot say. So in my own research, when I did a lot of work trying to understand why engineers, environmental engineers particularly, couldn't engage with people's concern for their health. And it was a lot about what they felt they could say, what they felt, what was their subconscious understanding of what engineering was or something. It was very difficult for them to articulate. And I'm really interested in this question. Okay, sorry.
Just very quickly trying to tackle at Colin's comment, I think that is pointing out also an area that is challenging for us in terms theoretically and being consistent in how we can enrich our work, drawing from debates about epistemological justice that at the end of the day I think are at the core of how we are conceptualizing or expanding what we understand about knowledge co-production. And therefore when we are dealing and bringing theoretical discussions that comes pretty much from political thought, but if we want to push our understanding in our multi-scalar approach, but also understanding the spatiality of it, it's inevitable to draw from discussions that come from spatial justice and debates that are drawing from justice itself. So I wouldn't be saying now that you can be interchangeably using those terms, but I think we cannot avoid drawing from those debates if we want to push or keep expanding on our understanding of co-production of knowledge, particularly when we are talking about urban equality. And I think that is something that it's going to be defining what we are going to be keep doing in the upcoming months.
So I won't take too long. I just want to acknowledge and thank the comments that have come in, particularly for our work. Colin's, sorry, not Colin, Michaela's idea of variety and Adriana's notion of translation. And I think it works particularly well within individual narratives and examinations as well, because particularly with language, for instance, and just to think through what that translation means, not just that it is from one language to another, but sort of translations across disciplines, translations across ideas, and translations from the individual to the community in sort of the larger sense of it. So I'll hold it there. Thank you so much.